You were with CNN and the headline news service and some other agencies, initially as sort of a law enforcement analyst, talking about the deaths of Michael Brown and other people. How did that transition into the book?
Right. Well, I think what had happened to me was my background was in English. My undergraduate degree is in English, and I always had this penchant and interest in writing. And you can't do it while you're on the job, unfortunately, in most positions, if it's not a state or local agency, particularly in the federal sector. But then I was being called to talk and called to give my expertise on CNN and other networks. And early on, it seemed like there was an incident maybe once every month or once every 2 months. But then at one point, and I don't remember the time, it might have been in 2016, it seemed as though I was getting called about every 2 days or every 3 days, and there was an incident after incident after incident. And it was always there's seeming injustice in the incidents. And a couple of incidents were more egregious than others. But I said to myself at some point, I keep giving the same commentary, and my commentary at the time was that the incident we just observed was inconsistent with any training I've ever received, since my time in the Fed, state, and local. So I felt at that point that I should use my platform and use my position to give a voice to action, and that's when we started talking about writing a book so that the public would understand a little bit more about what they were seeing, but also broadly that policing in general would understand more about what the public is feeling, and who better to do it than somebody that has their foot in both sides of the water.
We cover a lot of territory in the book and a lot of subjects in the book. One of the things, we spent 4 chapters just looking at Chicago. You went to Chicago. I talked to a lot of people in Chicago, looking at the blue line and how police covered up the shooting of Laquan McDonald. We went to Ferguson and talked to people in St. Louis there to understand how, in the shooting of Michael Brown, it really wasn't about the police starting that action. It was actually city officials and their use of police to sort of oppress African American communities that led to the shooting of Michael Brown. Right. We started the book out talking about how a black man, and it's funny, that's how we met everybody, talking about how black men are perceived as the boogeyman. We're already, as soon as you see us, we're almost always suspicious. There's something about us. As you go through all of that process, is there any incident that has happened recently that you say, yeah, that really is reflected about what we talked about in the book? Sure.
Well, it's ironic that I'd be back here in Philadelphia, and this is no way reflective of how I feel about the department, but certainly we all saw what just happened at Starbucks a couple months ago. And what we talk about in the book is that as police officers, we're asked to do things. We're called to places because people call us to do a job, and whether it's a business, whether it's a person, but many times we're called into places and we're asked to do things because of policies that we don't create, but then we're forced to take actions based on the policies. So Starbucks was a vivid example of that. The way you saw that incident unfold, it was the officers who drew the ire of the international world, but the officers didn't create the policy that, number one, begged that they be at that incident, and number two, the policies that said take these individuals out. So many times we're put in a position, unfortunately, because of policy, that we are asked to do things that, and my other experience was that I've never met a law enforcement officer at any level who created their own strategy for fighting crime and keeping the public safe. Mm-hmm. You come to work and people tell you, we need your focus on this area or this thing or this special event or the Super Bowl or whatever it is we're told to do. So we're responding to, in large part, what the public has asked, or in large part, to what police departments and governments tell us to do.
And Starbucks actually sort of started with that whole black man as boogeyman.
Right.
Because those men were there, along with a lot of other white people in that establishment, and then because they were African American, they were singled out.
Right. Well, you learn, and I was very candid in my discussions in the book and said, listen, as an African American person, and as an African American law enforcement officer, I hold this position where you're never quite black enough and you're never quite blue enough. And you understand that when you come on organizations very quickly by the way you're treated within organizations oftentimes, and how you have to navigate politics just to rise up to the ranks, get promoted, get training, get assignments, things like that. So then you go out on the street and you're struggling with trying to enlist that support and trust that you need to do your job as a police officer. So I've seen it throughout my career at the local level, trying to get the public to trust you, We see it in Chicago now with what's happening in Chicago and other communities. Some people are scared to talk to the police and give information for the police. So consequently, Chicago has the lowest level of solved homicides in the country. So some people don't trust the police enough to talk, and some people are too scared of the police to give information.
We talked to a guy named, when you were talking about how things kind of flow downhill, we talked to a guy named Bobbie, who told a story about, and hopefully he shares, who told a story about how he ended up sort of beating up a guy because of a policy that came down about to clear a corner.
Yeah, it's a really good example for people to understand. And again, we go back to police officers doing things that they're asked to do. One of my good friends in the
Even
book,
though they didn't ask him to do exactly.
Even they didn't ask to do it, right. One of my good friends in the book is a retired white New York City police detective. And he tells a very candid story in the book about how he was told one afternoon to go clear a corner. And he needed to clear the corner in Manhattan because the city council was having a ride-through later that day. So this becomes political. Now the corner's never clear any other time, but now we want that corner clear. So he goes and asks his superiors, and I can see it happening because I think it's happened to me, well, how do you want me to clear the corner? And the superior said, I don't care how you clear, just make sure nobody's there when I come there with these people for this run-through. So he tells a story in the book very vividly about going to the corner. He gets out of his car with his partner and says to somebody, hey, get off the corner. And then somebody, of course, says to him, I don't have to do anything you tell me. This is my corner, I'm staying. Well, him and his partner proceed to beat the people down and clear the corner and tell them they'll never come back again. But that's the reality, and people who've been in my shoes and others understand that they were told to do that, and that was endorsed by people who are giving the directions to do it. And he said, hey, I would have preferred not to, but I knew that when these council people came back here this afternoon, there better not be anybody on that corner, it better be clear. So it's a vivid example of what happens in policing. And most people I know have been put in that position at one point or another in their lives, whether it was the right thing to do or not.
And I guess Ferguson would be an example of that, in that whole policy of the police handing out excessive tickets actually didn't start with the police, it started with the city manager.
Yeah, well, I guess there was a city manager hired that we talk about in the Ferguson chapter where they were told to increase revenue in Ferguson. And the way you increase revenue is by giving out more fines. And the way you increase that revenue is by giving out more fines. So Ferguson was a situation that we found, it was really despicable because the people who were the most vulnerable had the most fines. And because they had more fines, and because you got your ticket towed, and because they tacked on tinted window, failure to do this, broken tail light, sometimes people couldn't get their cars out. Then the cars stay in, you get more fines, they go higher, you don't pay the fines, you get a warrant, then you go to jail. And it was being manifested in such a broad way that the people around the world didn't know that this situation existed as it had. But going back to policing, the police officers were the ones that were told by city managers and mayors to do this. They were told, when you stop someone and you give a violation, don't give 1, give 5. If you can give 7, give 7. They were told to do this, and this is how people lived in Ferguson, Missouri for years and years. So what you all saw on television really was the flashpoint of what people have been suffering. Now, how this impacts politics? We were told by people in Ferguson during the research for the book that what would happen is even some of our elderly residents, they have warrants or fines on them just because they didn't pay certain fines involving expired licenses. So then people wouldn't vote.
Yeah, in some cases it was just about, I think one lady, her trash can top was not on top of her trash can.
Right. So then what happens is because people have these fines out there, these warrants, then they don't vote because they don't want to go down and they don't want to sign the registry because they're afraid of being identified and afraid of being arrested. So it was a really, really vicious cycle in Ferguson, and we learned a lot about it. But police were at the end of that chain that government was telling police what to do and how to do it.
One of the things you talk about in the book is that there's racism, but there's also bias, and it's some of the biases that everybody in this room has. And it comes from television, it comes from books we read, it comes from what our parents and our grandparents tell us. Watch out for short people, or watch out for Asians, or watch out for that these people take precedence. You were saying a lot of times cops carry those things around with them.
Sure, we say in several areas in the book that for whatever reason there's there's a struggle right now in the world, and in the police ranks, of which I'm a part of, they want to say there's no racism. And then everybody else sees that there's racism, right? Yes. But for those of us that lived and worked in that side, we know, because we know when you work with people 10 and 12 hours a day, you hear their language when they're not in the public. And so in a lot of that language, it can be direct racist language, but for the most part, what it is what we call implicit and unconscious bias. And that comes out and that manifests itself in the way that law enforcement services are delivered.
How did it ever come out with you? Did you ever have an incident where you said, oh wow, my own personal bias is kicked in? Sure.
Well, one thing comes to mind. I was on a call when I was on the PD, and I responded to a domestic call, which for us in law enforcement, domestics and traffic stops is one of the most dangerous things you can do. And I responded, and there was a Hispanic male who had been assaulted, visibly assaulted, because his eye had a bruise. And he said to me when I got outside the apartment that, Leslie's got to go, Leslie's got to go. I want Leslie out of the apartment. So my partner and I go up. My partner was a female officer. And we go up and we're prepared to meet at that time what we thought was a woman. Of course. Right? That's what we expected to meet. That was an unconscious bias on my part because Leslie didn't have to be a woman. And as it turned out, Leslie was a man. So now we get into the department and we start having this discussion with Leslie. And Leslie's a pretty big guy. I was pretty big at the time. And he's sitting down at the time. And so we tell Leslie, well,
he's a black man, right?
He's a black man. So if you want to assume that boogeyman position that black men should be feared, which I've never held, but my partner could have had. I don't know if she did or she didn't. So there's a very large black man sitting on a couch, and we're telling him, well, your partner is following charges, and you need to go downstairs with us, and you need to do it now because we're not going to be here all day, and that's where we communicate in situations like that. And he starts telling us he's not getting up. So we start to have that discussion, and those of you in the room that do what I've done, you understand where that discussion goes. You are getting up one way or another. You're going out of this apartment, and you're going out soon. And so now things are getting sort of tense, and I'm starting to think about what's going to happen. And my partner, I could tell she's getting tense, and it was clear he was pretty big. We didn't know how big. So we say, look, at the end of the day, and I remember saying to him like it was yesterday, I'm only going to ask you one more time to stand up. And he stands up. Now Leslie, at this point, he's like 6'8", 300 pounds. So he's 6'8", 300 pounds. So now I got this 6'8" brother, 300 pounds. And so he stands up, and I said, no, I think I need you to sit down. and Leslie says, and then he says, you told me to stand up. I'm standing up. I'm not going to sit down. So now he's standing up, and I'm saying, well, look, we're going to regroup. I need you to sit down. I'm not sitting down. So now me and my partner are thinking, all right, now this is going to get bad, right? Because we've already told you, this was the last time I'm telling you, we're going downstairs one way or another. And at some point during that conversation, and we're going around, and I already decided, look, this is going to be on any second now, right? And this might get really bad because he's really big, and we're not going to get hurt here. So at some point in that conversation, Leslie puts his head in his hands and he starts to cry. Right? We didn't expect that to happen. We didn't expect it to happen. Everything ratchets itself down, and he starts telling us how he loves his partner and he doesn't want this to happen and blah, blah, blah. And then we get to a point where we say, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to walk downstairs, we're going to put you in handcuffs, and we're going to go to the police department. And that's exactly what we did. But had we not had the patience, right, to just wait this out, and what we're seeing now, the way the dynamics are going on in today's environment, Leslie might have caught it at any point during that incident. And unfortunately, everyone walked out of there and everyone went home.
And that sort of played out in the shooting in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting dichotomy because when you look at what happened in Tulsa with Terrence Crutcher and Betty Shelby, you had five police officers on the scene. You had a person that was walking away, that wasn't paying attention and wasn't complying, as we call it. One officer shot, 4 officers didn't. One officer was in fear of her life. The other officers weren't, right? And she and her husband, that was in a helicopter above, without having any independent knowledge of Mr. Crutcher, used the term to them, that looks like one bad dude. So that goes back to this boogeyman effect of you're black, you're big, you look a certain way, your pants are in a certain way, you're dangerous. So as long as in law enforcement we have that crutch to fall back on and say, I felt a fear of my life, he's dangerous, we always have that explanation when things go bad. We can say, hey, I was in fear of my life, I didn't know what was going to happen, and that's why I shot.
One of the things discussed in the book is that in a lot of these shootings of African American men, you're looking at departments or deaths of African American men, you're looking at departments that had black police chiefs.
Right.
In Baltimore, for instance, with the shooting of Freddie Gray, with the killing of Freddie Gray, and with the recent video of a black guy beating up a guy, the current police commissioner is black. The previous police commissioner was black. The police commissioner when Freddie Gray died was black. And even 6 others before them were black. Similar situation in Cleveland. In Cleveland, where Tamir Rice was killed, the police chief was black. And we can kind of go around. There are lots of situations. You know, I would say to you, it's like, well, wait a minute. I thought the whole idea of having these black police chiefs, even in Philly, you know, where we had the Starbucks thing, weren't things supposed to change? Why aren't things changing?
Well, so there are several reasons for that, and we talk about that in the book. And the main reason really is a leadership concept. And I've spent a lot of time studying and being a leader and leading the troops into battle and in shootings. And there's this concept that culture eats strategy for lunch. So, and what that means in police organizations that have very strong personalities, strong unions in some cases, type A personalities, changing behavior and conduct becomes so difficult at times. It is very difficult even for the best leaders to sort of turn things around. And you make a great point. In the book, we go at great lengths to say that it's really not about black and white. It's about black and blue.
Right.
Because when you start looking at the numbers, as you pointed out, the Baltimore Police Department is 52% black.
42%.
42% black, but they're still under a consent decree.
Wow.
Some of the other police departments around the country that are under consent decrees have large black police officer populations. So it's not only white folks that are committing these acts on the job that are causing these departments to come under consent decrees. And in fact, the last couple of incidents, including the one in Baltimore, was a black police officer under a black chief with black lieutenants and black captains. So it's not just us versus them in that regard. It's what this book is about. It's not an attack on police. It is a discussion about bad policing.
Not necessarily bad police officers, right?
No, bad policing, bad policy, bad strategy.
So what is a part of that the whole blue line? One of the things we talked about was how police in most of these departments have an allegiance to police officers, even bad police officers. And that police does more so than they have an allegiance to the people who pay them to protect and serve.
Right. Well, we are taught, and this is the truth of the matter, and there's not a police officer I know that won't say this. Mm-hmm. We are taught, as soon as you get out of the police academy, 2 things. Number 1, forget everything they taught you in the academy. Because things are very different out here in these mean streets. I was told that in the first day on the job. Number 2, we're taught what happens in this car stays in this car. So that sort of creates in your mind that whatever we do needs to stay here. But then it gets worse because when you see these cases around the country, like the Laquan McDonald case, where
this is in Chicago.
I don't know if you all saw the video. There's 5 police officers on site. 1 police officer shoots Laquan McDonald 16 times. No other police officer fires, but the other police officer lied on their reports.
Right.
And the police officers lied on their reports to support what the officer said who did the shooting. Right. Well, consequently, they've all been indicted and charged, and they're all doing jail time. But there is, in our culture, there is this thing that says, don't tell on your brothers. It's just, it has existed. But I think the only solution to it is once you get to the point, I know most black folks that do the job I do, they always say, look, I'm not losing my pension over you. So the idea is once the penalties become more significant for standing your ground and towing the line and sticking the blue.
You're talking inside the
Inside, yeah. Once the penalties become, because in New Orleans you had criminal cops down in New Orleans. You had cops running drug gangs, protecting drugs, doing stick-ups. We even tell a story in the book where a police officer in New Orleans committed an armed robbery in duty and killed a fellow police officer in duty and responded to the call when she got the radio call. Right? That
was a black woman.
That was a black female officer. But the point here to that one is she was identified early on in the hiring process as not being suitable to be hired by a psychologist.
And a
psychiatrist, but they hired her anyway. So we go back to, was it her fault she was on the job? No. Whoever signed off on that notice to say she needed to have a gun and badge did the wrong thing, so it was a policy. So we go back to, it's not the police officer. In East Pittsburgh recently, with the officer in East Pittsburgh, this officer had worked for 3 different departments in 8 years. He worked for 3 different departments in 8 years, and he had just hired on with the police department that day. They put him in a car, they gave him a uniform, they gave him a beat. He didn't know the community, he didn't know the nuances. He goes out in the car and he shoots someone in the back in less than 4 hours. Was it his fault that he was hired?
Right.
In the Tamir Rice case in Chicago, we now know that in Cleveland, we now know that Cleveland did not do a good enough screening and vetting process because this officer had worked for 3 different departments.
Well, actually, he had worked for just a refresh. He had worked for a department, and they found that when he got a gun in his hand, he went crazy. And they said, "We're not going to hire you." And he left there and went to the Cleveland Police Department.
Right. So again, going back to the point, this is not about police officers. This book is not about police officers. This is about policy at a very high level that puts the public at risk.
We travel to a lot of different places. I'm just trying to remember all of them. Chicago, Seattle, St. Louis, Ferguson, New York City, Baltimore, Memphis, New Orleans, to look at all of these things. And right now we're talking about a lot of the bad news. Did you see any things in any of those cities that sort of give you hope that gee, we can turn this around?
Well, I think New Orleans is a very vivid example because in New Orleans, you had a department where both a prior chief and a colleague, Richard Pennington, started the process of turning around that department, but he had to do it. He actually fired I think they had over 400 officers who left the department, that were fired, were disciplined, or removed from service, or arrested, indicted, and put in jail. And again, the new chief, Michael Harrison, is still executing that change management strategy to get officers to understand that certain things are unacceptable, and if you commit these sort of acts, you're going to be fired or removed from service or disciplined. So New Orleans is a great example. Seattle's a good example where they prioritize training and community engagement and getting the community involved with what you're doing. Another great example.
Chicago, Mike, I guess would be.
Chicago, Eddie Johnson, what he has to deal with in Chicago, black chief there. They're instituting all kind of new training initiatives. Also, what they're starting to look at now is wellness for officers, because that's one of the areas where, for whatever reason, law enforcement hasn't graduated to taking care of their officers. And most police organizations don't have wellness programs for their police officers. And mental health is a very real issue in policing. And the things we see and the things we do expose us and make us more vulnerable than the rest of the population. But most officers, when you say mental health, I got nothing to say, I don't want to talk to anyone, I don't want to do anything. But when you start talking to police culture about yoga and working out and fitness and mental fitness, there's not a police agency I know that screens their officers every 3 or 4 years to make sure that they're okay.
Right. They test every year you have to do gun tests every year.
Oh, you do firearms tests a couple times a year. So we test to make sure your shooting skills are proficient, but we don't do anything to make sure that your head is where it should be, to be out here dealing with the most complex problems in society.
You talk a little bit about things that they can do, like de-escalation training, I think.
Right. Well, many departments now are doing things to put more emphasis on de-escalation training. So the public wants to know, why did you have to do this instead of doing that? And to resort to your firearm as the first option is not what we're trained to do anyway. We have what we call a use of force continuum. And the use of force continuum is supposed to begin from the time you start speaking to someone until the time you get them to where you need to be. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it moves from level 1 to level 6 in 3 seconds. And sometimes you can take your time. Like when you think about negotiators and what they do, they take their time to get people from one place to another. But one of the challenges and we cover this in the book, one of the biggest challenges right now law enforcement is facing is we're being asked to do things that we are not qualified to do. And what we talk about mental health in that matter. So 1 out of every 4 police shootings in the United States is involving someone with mental health. There's not a cop I know, and I know thousands, that has a degree in psychology, psychiatry, or dealing with people that have mental health issues. So I use an example. And everybody in this room could be as guilty of it as I am. You have friends and family members who have mental health issues. You know they're off their meds. They're presenting a challenge to you. So who do you call? You call?
Actually, they call 911.
You call 911, and 911 sends 3 police officers.
Right.
You as the family member, or I, already know that the person's off their meds. They created a risk to you, and you call us. And then people in mental health conditions oftentimes are not able to respond. They're not able to respond to normal commands. And I'll give you an example. In my community in Lehigh Valley last year, and these were white police officers and a white suspect. Well, there's an individual in the street that has 2 swords. He's naked, he doesn't have shoes on, and he's yelling obscenities. Now, I've been called to calls like that, but at the end of the day, we want you to drop those swords, and we want you to come with us or drop this whole thing down. And if you don't drop those swords, it's only going one direction, right? The question becomes, did it have to go that direction? And was there somebody more suitable that could evaluate that person and say, they're schizophrenic, they're bipolar, they're not responding, how do you communicate? I know people in the mental health field that can talk anybody down, but they're not with us when we're on those calls. So it becomes an issue of, and then people go, this person didn't have to die. Well, they didn't, but the police didn't have to come. We're the ones that are called, we're put in that position, and 1 out of every 4 police shootings, 1 out of every 4 police shootings.
One out of every 4 deaths by police
is mental health.
In fact, we looked at us and found out that while black men are 3 times more likely to be shot by police, people in mentally ill people are 16 times more likely to be shot by police. And it goes back to one of the things you talked about in the resources, that families they don't call for the police. They say, my son is mentally ill and he's having an episode, and they call 911. They may even say, in some of those cases we looked at, we need someone to take him to the hospital. They don't send a wagon to take him to the hospital, they send police. And so police are unfairly asked to deal with situations they're just not qualified to deal with. They don't send a medical person, they don't send EMS, they don't send anybody like that. You met a lot of people. You talked about to a lot of them, from David Lomax, who's a cop in St. Louis, ATF agent as well, and lots of different people. One of the people you talked about in the book is Amy Hunter.
Sure.
Can you tell us a little bit about Amy Hunter?
Well, I think the best way to illustrate anyone's commitment, concern to community is sort of read, and if you bear with me and indulge for a couple minutes, I'll read the last two pages of one of the chapters talking about people in St. Louis. And I think what you can do by this story, I think the story resonates with anyone who's ever had a discussion with a young black man. And after we do this, we're going to entertain a Q&A, I think for as long as Uncle Bobbie allows us to. And then we'll move over to the bookstore to sign books. But in the Q&A, we want candid questions, and we're going to try to offer candid answers. As a part of my effort to further explore the issue, I traveled to St. Louis and Ferguson, Missouri, where the police shooting of 18-year-old Michael Brown in 2014 sparked rioting and reignited the decades-old conversation about the shootings of African Americans by police. Brown's death was followed quickly by the killings of other African Americans by police. This galvanized this new discussion. I wanted to understand what sparked the incident in Ferguson. What had been happening in a town of only 21,000 people that has pushed us to where we are now? What I soon discovered was that for black residents in Ferguson and in St. Louis, the relationships between African Americans and the police were nearly identical. As I met people, I encountered a wonderful young woman named Amy Hunter. She gave me a deeper understanding of just how personal and deep the fear, the anguish, and the anxiety about police stops goes for African American parents. She lives in the upscale University City neighborhood of St. Louis, where median incomes run about $100,000 and where crime is largely an afterthought. There are no drug houses on the corner, no drive-by shootings, no gangbangers at every turn. Still, she and her then husband made a pact that they would give them the talk, the conversation many black parents have with their children about the special procedures they must follow when they are invariably stopped by police. We sat them down and told them how to behave if the police should stop them. Hunter told me over the dining room table of a friend in an even wealthier St. Louis suburb. We told them, don't smart off, regardless of what they say. Do exactly what they tell you to do. We just want you to come home safe. We will handle whatever happens. We don't want to have to identify your body because you've been shot by a police officer. Hunter was also one of the hundreds of protesters who lined the streets of Ferguson night after night following the shooting of Michael Brown. By her count, she was on the street nearly every day following the shooting, including the freezing cold nights when they protested against the backdrop of the city's Christmas decorations that read, "Season's Greetings." She was tear gassed and held at gunpoint with M16 rifles pointed at her head, her chest. I asked her why an upper middle class woman who didn't live in the Ferguson and who had not experienced what its residents endured at the hands of police would be so dedicated to the Ferguson protest. I reminded her that she had told me her sons were now grown and doing quite well. It certainly must not have sat well with her employers that she was out there every day putting herself at risk, I observed. Why would she do something like that? She looked at me with a kind, almost patronizing look, and then she told me a story. When her sons were 12, she dropped one off to hang out with his friends in an area in University City called the Del Mar Loop. The Loop is a popular entertainment district filled with specialty shops, restaurants, and music venues. Unless he was touring, local resident and rock and roll pioneer Chuck Berry performed there almost weekly until his death in 2017. When Hunter's son arrived at the Loop, his friends were drinking. He knew that was a no-no, so he decided to walk home. He lived less than 1 mile away. When her son was about 5 houses away from home, he would later tell his mother he saw police following him. Ultimately, he said, he was stopped, questioned, and searched. The police told him they stopped him because he matched the description of a man carrying a machete. He was 12, Hunter said. He was 5 feet tall. She recalled how flustered her son was when he arrived home, frustrated and trying to make sense of it all. He was asking all these questions because he was trying to understand it, she said. Her son told her he had done as she has instructed, but he still couldn't understand why the officer stopped him. He said, "But Mom, I'm wearing khaki pants and a polo shirt and a belt and it's tucked in. I have on Sperry topsiders." It was as if he thought his clothes could save him from the experience. But there's nothing he could wear that would save him from that, and I knew it. So he said, "Mom, I want to know, is it because I'm black?" I said, "I don't know, maybe." Her son continued to ask questions, she said. She could tell that he was troubled by the experience, the fear of being stopped by men with guns, the uncertainty of the outcome, the vulnerability. And as he talked, she could see that he was trying to hold back the tears that were welling up in his eyes. He looked at me and he said, "Mommy, I just want to know how long this will last." And then I looked at my 12-year-old son, now with tears rolling down my face, and I said to him, "For the rest of your life." She looked down for a few seconds and then back up at me. Now she had tears in her eyes. "That's why I went to Ferguson," she said. "I want this to stop."
All right, thank you. Okay, so we got to open this up for questions. Does anybody have any questions? We don't have a mic, so please just stand up and...
Let's start in the rear, please. Yeah, all the way in the rear.
Hi.
Hi.
I had a question about when you're talking about individual police officers and you're saying that if they're told to clear a corner or whatever orders are given, that these are policy orders and not, that these aren't individual police officers' decisions and they're just following orders. In your opinion, at what point can we hold individual police officer accountable?
Well, I don't know if we said it. Like, if we said that, I hope we didn't get that correct. It's not that police individual officers are not accountable. But I think, as we pointed out in the book, that there's sort of a chain of command, and even that officer told us, he said some of the things we did back in the 80s, I would go to jail for if I did that now.
Right.
Because you and by that I mean the people, have said that is unacceptable. And that is really, but the issue is we had to say that on a higher up level so that the policies inside those police departments changed. For instance, what Matt was, as he was pointing out, not putting words in your mouth, but as he was pointing out on those 2 officers in East Philly and in Cleveland, it's not that these guys are not at fault, and in fact they were punished in both of those situations. A lot of those say, but what keeps this from happening day after day after day? It's not that there's just a whole bunch of bad officers around, and there are some of those, but there are policies and procedures at that blue wall that says I can act with impunity and keep doing it this way. And I'm going to just go on just a little bit further in Baltimore, and some of you may have seen this situation in Baltimore. In Baltimore, there's a video out right now in which a black police officer comes up to a guy, and he's having words, and just next thing you know, he's just beating this guy viciously. He beats him to the point that he cracked his ribs. I think he broke his nose, and a couple other things. The guy ended up in the hospital for a day and a half. Now here's the story behind that story. He had already arrested this guy once, the month earlier. This was personal. And he had wrestled this guy to the ground, charged him with resisting arrest. What am I resisting arrest for? Charged him for assault, but nothing happened. Nobody in the department said, wait a minute, Ron, wait a minute, you got this thing here, I don't understand this. He felt, and we've seen this repeatedly, that he could act with impunity because there was no video. There was no system-wide review that says, no, this is unacceptable. So I hear what you're saying. It's not that these officers' actions are without fault, but overall, to keep that from happening day in and day in and day in and day in, you've got to have something on a higher level, which is Matt was talking about, that says, okay, that's not acceptable policing in our department.
You look to the, okay, I go to the right.
I'll just start with the example that you just gave. That cop he's out. He's not punished in any kind of way.
No, he is out. No, that cop you just talking about?
Did beat that man in
He's in charge.
Yeah, he is not on. First he was suspended, then he resigned, and now he's been charged. He's not on the police department.
Okay, well let's go back to the George Zimmerman case, because I haven't been myself since that killing, and this is the truth with Trayvon Martin. Now, George Zimmerman, in fact, it was the public that made him even be arrested.
True.
Okay, all right?
True.
These police are carrying a racism that I think comes from when whites owned black people. It's still very present and relevant, okay? The jury let him off, and we all saw the video. We heard it, the audio. And Zimmerman is sitting home now drinking a milkshake.
But to be clear on the George Zimmerman case, and I
Yeah.
always make sure no matter where I go in the United States, we got to make sure that we're clear about one thing. George Zimmerman was not a police officer.
True.
All right, so in having a discussion, we got to make sure we always remember that.
That is very true.
All right.
But the police didn't even arrest him right away.
But that goes back to, but we talked about that in the book, and that's what we were talking about a systemic issue.
Okay.
And that goes back to, we talked about this, it's a systemic issue in that you have seen video after video. We wrote a piece about this for CNN, and I had to look at, I guess, about 20 videos just to go through some of this stuff. And you have case after case after case in which we now have the videos. And you'll see, and you say the jury did find this police officer guilty. With Betty Shelby, right?
Yep. Well,
We've got the officer in the shooting of Philando Castillo. We've got a guy on the floor, I can't remember what city it was.
Arizona.
And that's what he's begging for his life?
Right.
Yeah.
Begging for his life. And they shot him, that officer got off. And the thing is, but that was a quote unquote jury of our peers.
Yes.
So I really hear what
Let me
you're
just
saying.
add this, then I'll sit down. Maybe this is utopian, but don't you think that perhaps the police should come out of the areas in which they live?
Well,
I don't know if this could ever happen, but it just seems to me that if the police came out, like this is Germantown, or yeah, this is Germantown. If they came out of this area, you know, maybe they wouldn't be so prone to beat a neighbor or a friend of a neighbor or cousin, or, you understand?
well, so you make great points, right? But having been in the executive rank so long, I do know that there have been enough studies to show that yes, policing is more effective overall when officers have a buy-in to their communities. Okay, but let me tell you what the reality of it is. The reality of it is that almost 1/2 of the police officers in New York City come from Long Island, where they've had no exposure to minority residents, friends, you know, neighbors or others. So that's the first reality. The second reality, and what the academics will tell you, is that, okay, that's a great argument, right? But unless you have you have to live in the city clause, then that becomes, and I know about this, for recruitment, unless you have to live where you work clause, right? Then that becomes a challenge. But then you have the people that will say, all right, fine. LA hired people from LA, look what happened in the Rampart Division. Baltimore has 42% black police department, look what's happened in Baltimore. Chicago's having everything that happened there, look at the number of black officers in Baltimore who are from Chicago and live in Chicago. So to your point, the concept sounds really good, but it takes strategy, discipline, leadership, initiative, and a whole bunch of other things to come together to make sure that those officers do the job at a policy level the way the job is designed to be done. It's not only a matter of hire people from Germantown to work in Germantown. The other side of that point is, I can tell you from the federal perspective, it sounds good, right? But when I got on the feds, I didn't want to go to Detroit. So what the feds tend to do, federal law enforcement, is they hire African Americans in the FBI, DEA, Secret Service, ATF, and they send us to all the worst places in the United States. Why? Because other folks don't want to work there.
Right.
So if they don't want to work in LA, why do I want to work in LA? Los Angeles has 350,000 gang members. 1/3 of the population of Philadelphia. And I'm not talking about people that want to be gang members. We're talking about well, you know, you live in California, so you know, 350,000. So it works. What you say is very utopian. It sounds good, but it requires leadership, discipline, and strategy to get it accomplished. Yes, sir.
There's just a couple of comments. I read the part about, it was kind of amusing to a degree in the book when I read it, but I seen the severity of it. Was about being on 42nd Street and the prostitutes and taking their shoes and hats, and it's kind of amusing to a point. But what I wanted to say, you're speaking on the mental health piece, and I took a couple of courses with first aid, and according to what they told me, is that they have a if you call 911 and you have a situation like that, you're supposed to ask for a CTI trained officer. Is that, you know anything about that?
Different departments do have access to mental health professionals that can come on scene, and they know how to deal with a person differently. That's schizophrenia versus bipolar.
Seattle, I think, is
Seattle
one.
has one. Philadelphia might have some. But here's the challenge with that. See, and this goes back to policy. Darryl, you heard me ask them about policy yesterday in our meeting to the people that were on the panel at the ATF day. The policy is this. It's a good soundbite to say you have that available, but there is no way in Philadelphia or Chicago or Washington or LA or Detroit that there is enough of those people to respond to every mental health call that police get.
But they could.
But they could, right?
But
they could,
not there.
but they're not there, not to that extent.
And the other piece was about the Baltimore situation. I think, you know, I'm not thinking for the officer, but I'm just looking at it on a broader scale, is that since the Freddie Gray incident and nothing was really done, I guess he felt in his mind that, well, listen, you know, because it's like the district attorney did what she's supposed to do. Everything came together, and then almost everything was pretty much thrown out the window. So I guess they got their green light after everything happened with them, and plus the officers got their job back and got their money.
Well, I wouldn't say they got a green light. However, I hear what you're saying,
Okay.
because you're right. She tried. I thought she did I live in Baltimore.
Mm-hmm.
I thought she did she was over her head in that investigation. She didn't say, you know, I need to call in the best prosecutor in America and put him on the pay, or him or her on the payroll, pay them $200,000 to prosecute this case. Just like in other cases, you get the best
independent prosecutor.
Yeah, independent. Just like in other cases, you get the best defense attorney. If you really want these guys to go, you really got to do that. Since that, there was the arrest of the gun task force. They had some brothers running. This was it 7 people?
Yeah.
5 of them were
Overtime.
black, 2 of them were white. This is where we go past that black-white thing. 5 of them were black, 2 of them were white. They were literally robbing drug dealers and robbing people and planting evidence and doing all kinds of crazy stuff. Those guys are gone. However, they were gone because of a federal investigation.
Yeah, the FBI got into that one.
Yeah.
And there's something to keep in mind also about what you said about Freddie Gray. You know, that was a number of years ago. But remember this, and this is something if you take away nothing from this conversation in this book, just remember this. The only thing that the public at large is really talking about is what they see on video.
Right.
What you see on video only represents a very small percent of all the calls for service that are done in all these different organizations every day. And there are many more incidents that you're just not aware of,
Right.
because you're not going to hear about them, you don't have exposure to them. Both the good and the bad.
Right.
And they're all not bad, right?
And I think Matt hit a good point, and I just wanted to say this. While we do point out the bad, it's kind of like a lot of things, you address the issues when they're bad, but there's a lot of good that goes on. I mean, as a person who researched this, there's a lot of good and great officers who do incredible things. We talk about a woman in the book who, I can't remember what city that was in. She went to court, she's an officer of the court, she stood there, a woman got convicted for stealing food to feed her daughter. She went out and bought that woman food. Kindness like that, mentoring like that, of saying to of officers who see a kid acting up, he said, I know this fool. I know his mama lives on this street. I'm not taking you to juvenile, I'm taking you home to your mama, so you're really gonna get punished. There are officers who do that. And so I don't think we should lose sight of all the good work officers do. And finally, this is the last thing, we talked about this in the book, is that nobody needs good policing, more than communities where you have high crime. So we, in high crime neighborhoods, and all black people don't, contrary to what some people think, all black people don't live in high crime neighborhoods. But whether you're Latino, white, whatever, you need good police officers, and you need a good relationship with the police department. So that's why we're so focused on this issue.
I also just wanted to say that it was, my opinion, it was courageous for y'all to come out with that book, because we don't see that many books like that, and just to shed some light on the other side of it that a lot of people don't realize. You know, the gentleman was saying about, you know, certain police officers, and you were saying, you know, I know a lot of them, you know, across the country, and actually a best friend of mine is in homicide right now, and the odd thing about it is that, I mean, he does his work, but then he'll call me just to get an opinion. I'm like, what do you call me for?
I like you.
Yeah.
So first I want to thank you for, of course, writing the book and addressing the issue of policy versus just the policing level itself. With that being said, I think as a community, that what I see is that we're constantly having to react to police involved shootings or police misconduct, that we never really position ourselves in such a way where we can be proactive to address the policy issues. And so if we're constantly reacting, whether it's on social media or at our tables for dinner, by the time we at least start the process of healing, there's another traumatic incident that we have to process. That being said, what strategies on a local level would you give to this room and to those of us who are in law enforcement who stand by the community? What advice would you give as to how we mobilize to address and attack the issue of strategies or policies pertaining to training, pertaining to recruitment, and pertaining to community policing?
Well, so I think I have a couple answers to your question. Number one, in the book is not just about my position on things. We use people like Phil Banks, Phil Banks is a former police chief in New York City. Phil Banks is African American. He's my fraternity brother. I've known him for 30 years. He's represented in the book. Kathleen O'Toole, she was the first white police commissioner in Boston. Chris Mangus, first woman white police chief in Boston. Chris Mangus is in Tucson. So, to your point, organizations, and Daryl and I and others in the room have also been a member of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives and others. Some of the top chiefs in the country, top executive law enforcement officers, have instituted strategies in many of the United States cities that have worked. But it all begins with a commitment to engagement. Now, one of the things that Phil Banks talks about in the chapter, and we talk about this in the book, Phil says, in our communities, right? So there is that part of it that officers need to be more engaged. Officers need to get out of their cars. We need to put more people on footbeats. I heard Commissioner Ross say the other day that we're putting new officers on footbeats. All that stuff is great because you need to be connected to the community instead of guys riding around in cars staring at people. I was in my neighborhood the other day in Colorado. I'm riding by a guy in a patrol car. He's like staring at me like, yeah, I got a problem. I mean, those kind of things create the problems, right? Now, but you need strategy that comes from the top. I'm a big fan of leadership. It starts from the top. But one thing Phil Banks said in the chapter on Phil, he said, listen, every community, every church should have a police liaison. Every single church, if there's 1,000 churches, 100 churches, or 5,000 churches, every church that has a person or people, and all they do is communicate with the police, tell them their concerns. Because in Chicago, like Commander Crystal King Smith, a friend and colleague from Nobledale, says, communities have to teach police how they want to be policed. You can't just put it on a police chief who comes into Philadelphia from Seattle or Washington to fix it all.
Is that what you guys?
No. Well, and and that gets into it again. You need strategies that involve the community and the policing. So you need cops to get out of their cars. You need people to get engaged. You need people to talk to more people. You need the people to be concerned about the community, to your point, about having officers from the community. But then you also need community members that are committed to communicating. This has been one of the funniest things I've learned in law enforcement, right? Is that the community calls the police, says, look, Boo-Boo is on the corner. I want Boo-Boo off the corner. He's out there every day. Y'all not doing nothing. You're not doing anything about Boo-Boo. He's dealing drugs. He's got a gun. He's driving a stolen car. Y'all can't get Boo-Boo off the corner. Well, police come to the corner. They get in a chase and a shootout and shoot Boo-Boo. And now the community is screaming because Boo-Boo's dead. Right? It's a very interesting. The same people who called the police are now angry. But they're angry because it's just another person bleeding in the street of many. So there are a lot of things that can be done, and there's more that should be done. I think it starts with leadership at the top in police departments, but it also starts with community engagement at the community level.
Now this is where Matt and I differ a little bit on that. Because I believe you got to have the leadership at the top.
We do differ.
But you are the leadership. At the end of the day, you are the leadership, and you're on the leadership at a lot of local level. And I go back to what Crystal King said in Chicago, and what Phil said. In other words, when he talked about every church having a liaison with police, he wasn't talking about it with the police chief. He said, there is a police officer assigned to your neighborhood. You need to know his or her name. They need to come to your church, or you need to meet with them and say, this is what we want to happen. I was going back to Chris. She was talking about a situation at one point where she was driving through a neighborhood, and they called, and the women walked over to her car and they said, why do your police officers call us bitches and hoes? Wow. She said, what are you talking about? She said, yeah, they drive up and they say, hey, come here, bitch. Come to the car, hoe. And she had to take them into the police department and write on a big board. She put all the words that you cannot lose. You can't use nigga, you can't use spick, you can't use hunky, you can't use any of these words. And she reinforced that. But she kind of we needed to have that conversation. And she was one of the people talking about on a very local level, that you need to know who are the people who are in my neighborhood. Who are the people who patrol this? Who are the people that... Now, here's the deal. We want to meet with him or her and explain to them how we want to be... No, we had a complaint about this, we had a complaint about that. And if we have to take it to your sergeant and then your lieutenant, we'll do that. That's right. But we need to have a relationship. It's not just... but we got to have a relationship, and that goes up. Now, the last thing I'm going to say, and then I'll shut up, is I think you bring a lot to the table. Here's what I mean is that one of the things we didn't talk about a lot is training. And what I have learned as a civilian going through this process is there are a lot of things inside police departments that people outside them, they don't get it. We don't know anything about de-escalation training. We don't know anything about all of that stuff. And Matt, we were talking about this whole mental health thing. We were talking about that. We were going through an episode, and Matt was saying, Ron, here's what happens when a mental health person goes with you. You go out, there's a guy swinging the machetes, he's naked. And the mental health person says, Ron, I see you don't have any clothes. Didn't we talk about that? And Ron's just still going at it, right? Ron, what medication you on? I'm on Xylex, but I'm not taking it. Why are you not? And they walk them through that process in a way that you and I never would. And no police officer is trained to do that. Because as Matt points out, you are trained to say, here are my commands, and if you don't respond to those commands, you're in trouble. Versus understanding, man, that guy can't understand anybody's commands. So I think it's a two-way street, and I think we really need officers to come to the table with the kind, and Noble does this, with the kinds of things that they see inside the department. Because only people in the business can say, no, there's a new kind of training out that we think works well. We think de-escalation training works well, or we think it's a piece of crap, or whatever people that can come and educate us on the things that we want from police.
I mean, I can only do one more question here, and then I'll entertain questions while and during and after the book signing as well. So I promise to do that. Here on the left.
So I have a quick question. When you talk about people not following your directions or commands or whatever, person's naked, person doesn't have any weapons on him or herself. I don't understand, if the person turns around, why are we shooting people in the back? Like, what kind of training is that? Like, why does something have to be a center mass kind of shooting, when you could shoot the person in the kneecap?
So let me, you know, it's funny you say that. I get a lot of questions. Some people have asked me that question in every city that we've been to. So I'm going to answer that in two ways. Based on the training I received, and I can only talk about the training, we are not authorized to shoot anyone in the back that doesn't present a threat to community or others. So that's the first thing, in the back. Second thing is, we don't shoot people in the leg because we're not trained to shoot people in the leg. We are trained to shoot people center mass. And in the government, it's center mass in the head.
I know.
So that goes back to, you do what you're trained to do. And just so that you know, every study that's also ever been done on shooting says that most officers miss their first several rounds anyway, when things get really hot. So if you hear about someone getting shot twice in the body and once in the head, that was either a very good shot or that police officer might have made a mistake in the shooting. So no, we are trained to stop the threat, and the threat comes from anything inside center mass. That is the reality. I can't change that. I don't think I want to change that in terms of what we do when we need to do that. But that is just the way it is. People ask me, why you shoot him in the leg? If I shot you in the leg, it was a mistake. I can assure you.